Well, here's a little story for you guys. Grab a cup of coffee, come on over by the fire, and I'll share something with you. It's a story about an old saddle. In 1938, there was a pretty big storm that came up in Wisconsin. The trees got shook up real bad. Most of the acorns were blown clean off the limbs. They laid on the ground for quite a while until one day a bulldozer came along and pushed them all off into a corner. A man with an excavator came by later and loaded the dirt and those acorns into a dump truck and headed down the road. That dump truck finally came to stop and dumped all that dirt out, and inside the dirt was one small acorn. Well, it took root, and after about 40 years, that acorn grew into a pretty good-sized oak tree. Then one day a man with a saw came along and cut the tree down, chopped up the wood and put it into a pile. The wood sat there for a couple of years trying to dry out until one day a fella came along and grabbed a few pieces and then he took it into a shop and began working it. Around the same time, an old boy down in Texas decided it was time for him to turn his herd into market. Those cows were loaded up into a truck and sent off to the city. Unfortunately, most of them would wind up as T-bone steaks and filet mignon. The cowhide was gathered up and sent off to a tannery to be made into leather. Now, some of that leather was of fine quality. Didn't have a mark on it. Several of those pieces were put in an old box and shipped out the door. That box arrived in San Angelo, Texas, and landed in the shop of Bill Guthrie. Old Bill's a leather worker. He can make just about anything out of a piece of cowhide. Yes, sir, he can make some of the finest belts you've ever seen. And his brother John makes some of the best boots around. But old Bill's specialty is making saddles. One day a young cowboy came in the store and said he was looking for a saddle. But old Bill was out of saddles, and that cowboy was mighty depressed. However, Bill's a good salesman, offered that cowboy a cup of coffee, and they sat down and talked about what kind of saddle the cowboy needed. The young man said, "I need a working saddle, nothing fancy. I need something with a strong saddle horn on it, not too high in the back, and it's got to be good and strong, last a long time, because I can only afford one saddle." Well, they sat down and drew out a picture of the horse's back as to fit the saddle and figured out how big it was and decided the style of a standard Western working saddle would be just right. Bill and the cowboy shook hands. He left the deposit, and Bill went to work. He went back to the shop and gathered up a couple of pieces of wood he'd got from Wisconsin, solid oak. Some folks like yellow poplar and laminated Baltic birch, but not for this saddle. So then Bill began to make the saddle tree and fill the young cowboy's order. He wrapped that saddle tree in a couple layers of heavy rawhide, soaked it up nice and neat. Set it off over the stove to dry and harden up, give the heart of the saddle strength. Bill worked for another 3 weeks on that saddle. He trimmed a piece here and added a buckle there. Pretty soon he was done. Had a fine example of a custom-made Western saddle. He was sure the cowboy would be pleased. Yes, sir, that cowboy showed up, and he had a smile as big as Dallas on his face when he saw that saddle. Fine custom leather. Wasn't too fancy, but it had the look of a good working saddle. So we paid old Bill and loaded up the saddle in his truck. Later that afternoon, the cowboy put the saddle on his horse. It was a perfect fit. He tied off the cinch and buckled up that belly strap, then placed his boots in the stirrup, grabbed the saddle horn and placed the other hand on the cantle and boosted himself up on the horse. The horse turned his head, looked at his rider as if to say, "Nice fit, buddy. Good choice." Well, they rode around that evening just to get the feel of the saddle, break it in a little bit. You could hear the new leather rub along the saddle as the horse walked along. But that would disappear here shortly. Part 2. Well, now, as the story goes, that cowboy, horse and saddle, worked at several more ranches over the next few years. They worked large herds and small, worked in the rain or sun until it was done. They traveled from town to town, as cowboys often do, trying to stay ahead of being hungry and having a place to stay. As time passed, the cowboy, horse, and saddle began to show their age, and just like all things, there comes a time when a fellow knows that seasons are about to change. The young cowboy had turned into an older man. The horse had given his best, and the old saddle began to wear. They all slowed down for a while, started working rodeos across the country. There was Cheyenne, Fort Worth, Las Vegas, Memphis, Tennessee. After a while, all the towns and arenas started looking the same. One night in Colorado Springs, the old cowboy got pinned up against a stock fence by a rather angry young bull. The horse reared up and smacked the bull on the forehead, right between the eyes. The horse had killed that bull with a single stroke of his hoof and the iron horseshoe which it held. The horse was protecting his rider, more than likely saved the old cowboy's life. But the promoter and the owner of the bull didn't see it that way, and the cowboy lost his job. They drifted for a while, rolled down to Florida, and worked a couple of racetracks, exercising horses for the winter, and, well, those summer months began to get a lot hotter. They all longed for the higher, cool mountain ranges and headed back to Colorado. The old cowboy was getting tired now. He could feel it in his bones. He knew he didn't have any miles left, and neither did that old buddy of his. So late one Sunday evening, he picked up the phone and called his brother. They talked for a while and figured it was best that they got together and retired on the brother's ranch down in New Mexico. For about 5 years, things were pretty quiet. The brothers worked their small herd and made a good living. Well, then one Saturday evening, they were riding back to the house, and the old cowboy's heart gave out. He grabbed his chest with one hand as the horses came to a stop, and his brother held him there in the saddle. They looked each other in the eye. The old cowboy smiled and closed his eyes one last time. 3 days later, the horse that carried that old cowboy for all those years finally laid down, took a long, deep breath, and passed away. About 6 months later, his brother decided he'd had enough, sold off the ranch and tack, and headed off to Georgia to be with the rest of the family. The old saddle changed hands several times, going from one cowboy to the next, until finally it wound up in a pawn shop in Oklahoma. By this time, the old saddle was in pretty bad shape. Some of the original leather was so old it would crumble in your hand. The pawn shop owner set it up on a wooden brace in the corner, where it gathered dust for nearly a year. One day a fellow from Texas came in, saw the old saddle sitting in the corner. Now you might think an old piece of leather like that wouldn't be of much interest to folks. Nobody had interest in it, really, because times have changed. The world's a different place now. Not much room for an old Western working saddle. Well, the Texan picked up the saddle, checked the saddle tree, looked at the stitching, checked the D-ring, looked at the lining. He asked the clerk how much he wanted for the saddle. The guy behind the counter said, "That old saddle? Been there for nearly a year. I'll make you a deal. $80 and it's yours." So he paid the clerk and loaded up the saddle, put it in his truck. After a week of work, 2 cans of saddle soap, and a few extra pieces of leather, the old saddle was looking pretty good. Next morning, the cowboy put the saddle on his horse. It was a perfect fit. He tied off the cinch and buckled up the belly strap, then placed his boot into the stirrup, grabbed onto the saddle horn, placed the other hand on the cantle, and boosted himself up on the horse. The horse turned his head and looked at the rider as if to say, "Nice fit, buddy. Good choice." Well, they rode around that morning just to get the feel of the saddle and break it in a bit. You could hear the new leather rub as the horse walked along, but that would disappear here shortly. Original story by M.G. Bucci. All rights are reserved. Copyright 2020. Y'all have a good one out here.